Okay, and speaking of reliable sources, I'm going to welcome up Molly, who's going to introduce our next panel.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is mollystarkdean. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and is the greatest privilege of my career to present to you a historic panel that will revolutionize how we think about the truth, technology, and the very future of our planet. Wiki friends and wiki foes, I present to you a warrior of climate deception. As a contributing editor, DSmog, she rips away the mask of corporate greenwashing and reveals how the hype sector enables climate denial. And as the co-founder and board chair of Women Do News, she leads a movement ensuring that women journalists receive their rightful recognition on Wikipedia's digital battlefield. Moderating in this corner, their pronouns are she, her, hers, Miss Emily J. Gertz. Humans and non-humans. Our next guest is a writer and a lawyer who has masterfully documented the hidden world of online knowledge. His groundbreaking coverage of Wikipedia has appeared in Slate, in Wired, in the New York Times, and now his novel, The Editors, inspired by the very platform we celebrate here today, has pulled back the curtain on the fascinating world of collaborative knowledge creation. Talking in this corner with the pronouns he, him, his, it's Stephen Harrison. Distinguished guests of the FBI's most and least wanted lists, completing this historic triangle of truth seekers, the prophet of digital age, as NYU's Vice President of AI and Technology in Education and the author of revolutionary works that predicted how technology would transform society, he has spent decades analyzing how the internet enables new forms of human collaboration that were previously impossible. Talking in this corner with the pronouns he, him, his is Clay Shirky. Ladies and gentlemen, as New York City approaches its 400th anniversary, these three minds will tackle the most crucial challenge of our time: how to protect and preserve truth in an age of rampant misinformation. And that, friends and enemies, is not a prediction, it's a spoiler.
Wow. I almost feel like I could just go home now. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. And I'm just going to kick it right off. Everyone's presentations leading up to this were great introductions to what we want to talk about. Now, speaking as an environment and climate reporter, I know we've been dealing with climate disinformation now for 3 decades, from the highest levels of government, state, federal. But since 2020, fringe theories about public health have begun to percolate their way up into those realms as well, up to the point that we recently elected a president who has nominated a person to lead our national health agencies who doesn't believe vaccines are good for public health. What you may not have heard, actually, in the barrage of news this week is that 2 days ago, the President Trump's acting Secretary of Health and Human Services, Dorothy Fink, she ordered an immediate pause on most of the public communications coming out of federal health agencies, including the Center for Disease Control's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, which is one of the most important sources of data for public health officials in this country. So, in this particular setting, at this particular time in the United States, our first question is, where does that put Wikipedia and Wikipedians who are trying to maintain Wikipedia itself as a reliable source of information?
First of all, I just want to say, when I was hearing Ryan, Richard, Pasita, and of course Molly with that intro, that enthusiasm, that passion is something I'm just always trying to get across in my coverage of Wikipedia. And maybe it's somewhat obvious to this group, but a lot of people don't know the passion and the dedication that people have as volunteers to this project. And so it's really good to see it in real life, kind of. I thought maybe, I get the sense that a lot of people here are very experienced Wikipedia editors, but maybe we could spend like 30 seconds just talking about like what we mean by a reliable source. Reliability on Wikipedia, what a reliable source is, really depends on the context. And what I'm getting at from your question is that the context has changed, right? Does the publication or the institution have a reputation for fact-checking and accuracy? Is it independent? Is it truly, people's tweets generally are not independent with respect to their own coverage? And so I would just say, just to kick it off, I think the overall comment that I have is just like, maybe the context has changed and that affects how Wikipedians are doing their work.
And I'll just say, again, to the point about engagement, I think it was Charles Peirce, the American philosopher, who pointed out that science, which seems like a dry, sort of fact-oriented field, actually relies on community. People often say science is a self-correcting enterprise, but in fact, people doing science are where the self-correction comes from. And when you look at, I mean, for me, the incredible one is some event begins and a page is created and there are people both adding to and correcting in near real time. The night Damascus fell and the Assad regime, there was a page instantly created called Battle for Damascus, and people were posting in real time and then arguing about, is this source real? Is this reporting real? The fog of war was not a metaphor in that particular, or was less of a metaphor at that particular moment. And then a little note appears at the top, proposed merging with the fall of Assad regime. Right, so the page has the lifespan of maybe 12 hours in which it was a critical source. And then people took a step back and said, this actually fits into a larger pattern. And I think that part of Wikipedia is underappreciated. The brilliance of calling it an encyclopedia is that told everybody, here's a way to deal with this tool. But in fact, it does things that no encyclopedia in history has ever been able to do, like creating a near real-time residue of reporting that then very quickly becomes not just the first draft of history, but all subsequent drafts of history. So it moves us from journalism to record without ever changing the method it works in. And the only way that works is if people are engaged in that kind of back and forth, the self-correcting exercise of Wikipedia. I will say in the spirit of reliable sources that the huge threat right now isn't the engagement of Wikipedians themselves. There is some risk from being tired out by AI slop or partisan attacks. But the big risk is the loss of facts upstream. There is an attack on factual accuracy and on the availability of facts that is quite profound. Even just in this week, things like NIH, NOAA, NASA, simply cutting off all communication with the public. Nothing like that has ever happened, certainly in U.S. history.
Yeah, it's really quite frightening. Speaking as a journalist also, it really puts in question where a lot of us, Wikipedians and journalists, share this problem of what are the reliable sources. And we are being very U.S.-centric here, I realize, but the U.S. agencies are often primary sources of information for countries and people all over the world. With the snap of a finger, all of that has been shut off, and we don't know what comes back, and we don't know how much we can trust it, which is just profoundly disorienting. So how do we cope with, well, okay, and I'll set that up further to say, we've also got the issue of, with the collapsing, there's a shrinking number of the types of citations that we would use as Wikipedia editors to bolster and substantiate and justify our entries. So, Stephen, what do you think we, as journalists, what are we doing about that? And what do you think we can offer to Wikipedians when in a situation like this?
Well, I don't think I've quite figured out what to do yet as a journalist in terms of what I think you're getting at is the economics. I was having dinner with some friends last night who are journalists. In some ways, we're talking about the glorious 2010s. Like for digital media, it was a lot easier to get full-time or freelancing opportunities. And it's publications, we're talking about BuzzFeed, Vice, and things like that, that were at one point, they were anointing the star makers. There's a really great piece if you want to read on it. It's called 10 Years and a Crumbling Industry. But I told myself we're going to focus on the positive here. So what can the Wikipedians do? I think understanding that reality is important to Wikimedians, and it might not change policy, but you might say, okay, well, this is not being covered just, for example, by the New York Times, but it is covered by the Brooklyn Eagle, and looking at other sources that have a reputation for fact-checking and accuracy. The Village Voice, I'm hearing good things about Hellgate as another one. So I think that's sort of the practical thing that the editors can think about.
And I'll say to your point about the shutdown of communications from federal agencies, we're so used to the federal government producing just an astonishing array of facts, morbidity and mortality weekly, maps, environmental data, temperature data, all of it. And we're disoriented now that those data sources have closed down. But in the spirit of this being Wikimedia NYC, New York State and New York City and boroughs also produce data. And I think we should all get more familiar with those sources, because we may not be in a world where the federal government goes back to producing the data it produced really as of last Sunday. The shutdown among the government agencies, as I said, we don't know what's coming back. The one thing I will say, it is not focusing on the positive, I guess, but the Harper government in Canada did this in the middle of the aughts. In 2006, 2007, the federal government of Canada at the time shut down several research libraries and shut down all reporting on environmental or indigenous issues because they simply didn't like the pressure the facts were creating on their government to react to those things. We may well be in a situation with that vis-a-vis our government. I think, and I've been this week looking this up, like what did the Canadians do when their government removed their federal source of facts? And one of the adaptive strategies is to look to state and local governments. The really radical strategy is for Wikimedia rather, to start producing its own facts. Should Wikimedia own a satellite? Should they own temperature stations? Are there places where you can just get to the facts themselves without going through the mediating layer? Is that too close to Wikipedia producing the news rather than pointing to reliable sources? Would a satellite constitute a reliable source? There may be moments where we have to crowdsource the production of facts and not just their integration into Wikipedia articles.
Wow. I have a sort of secret identity as someone who's co-authored a couple books on DIY environmental monitoring. And that brings up the question of, like, there are other movements doing kind of aligned work, even if it's not identical to Wikipedia, obviously, but the maker movement is teaching people how to do just like what you're saying. There are people like doing DIY biology research, and environmental sensing projects have been going on for definitely more than a decade, like 15 to 18 years, I'd say. But on Wikipedia, we have a challenge, which is that these sources can be challenged. And so is there a way that Wikipedia can itself begin to adjust to this changing sourcing environment?
Well, I was thinking in your intro that, I mean, in my book, part of the plot is that a foreign government is trying to interfere with a Wikipedia-type platform. And what you're describing is almost even more thrilling or scary in a way with ours, but so maybe for the sequel. But I think what I would say, though, is I think Wikipedia editors need to also just make these arguments and these points maybe more clearly to the public. What I mean by that is when I talk to people, they would say, oh, Wikipedia doesn't allow certain sources, and they might say it's like censorship. It's not censorship. It's the goal of the Wikipedia or the encyclopedia is to be an accurate, factual encyclopedia reflecting reliable sources. And so what I think the talking point or the message needs to be to people is that these discussions on perennial sources and what is considered reliable or not are happening publicly. There's not like some secret cabal or event in New York where people are doing it. You can read the arguments and you could say this publication, the Daily Mail, others that do not have a reputation for producing reliable information. Those things get talked about, discussed, and then they're decided that they can't be used. That would be the change, I think, to just make really clear to people that these are open source, open argumentation and discussion. It's probably very clear to us here today, but I think that it's something that we could do a little bit better job talking about.
There was a comedian, Hassan Mehdi, who, as part of his act, said, these were a bunch of things that I lived through, or these are a bunch of things that I saw. It turned out that they were invented or modified. And there were a bunch of people who were startled that somebody who made a living telling stories told stories. And they had extended to that comic routine what you would ordinarily only extend to a journalistic outfit. There was a little bit of these stories are too good to check. I think the point about sort of explaining to people how Wikipedia works is to say, if an organization isn't punished for getting things wrong, you can't trust the output. No one at CNN was fact-checking the comedians, right? There was no downside. No matter what they said, I'm getting up and telling you a true story. There was no downside to that not being true. The reliable sources upstream of Wikipedia and Wikipedia itself both suffer terribly if it turns out that they're saying something that isn't true. And if they don't self-correct, they suffer more. That's what the acid test for a reliable source is. Are we reading something that's sourced upstream from an organization that has a strong incentive not to make things up? I think the big change that we're all seeing in this environment, and obviously the recent change in the administration makes a change at a federal level, but for a long time, there has been real tension about the political convenience or inconvenience of facts. What Ryan was saying about subway ridership, the politically inconvenient thing about New York City's subway for some people is that it's mostly safe. And the desire to say things that aren't true about that system is a reaction to the political convenience, not a reaction to the facts. I think we have to make the case collectively and to the readers and other potential editors of Wikipedia that we all have something at stake here if there's something included in a Wikipedia article that turns out to be wrong, and we can't afford to deal with sources that don't have that same commitment.
So with Wiki NYC's 400 project to begin improving, filling in, creating new and more broader information about New York City on Wikipedia, a project like that and the information it provides, how much is that serving the local population and how much is it serving a broader context of just documentation for documentation's sake? Would you say that's something that could become or could be a reliable source for people here to learn more about the city?
Sure, but I wouldn't make a distinction between useful for the people who live in a particular neighborhood versus documentation for documentation's sake. One of the things we know is that representation matters. If people can look up something about a neighborhood, about an environment in New York and learn about it, it's useful for everybody. I'll also say, as an old white guy, I'm steeped in privilege. And when I look at Wikipedia, I see neighborhoods that I know of in Brooklyn and in the Bronx, I don't know Queens as well, but that are just not represented. I hope that forum that we saw earlier is a way of opening up when is the documentation of East New York going to be as good as the Upper East Side, right? Bridging that gap, I think, is a good goal for this. The other thing I will say, again, to Ryan's opening remarks of sort of thinking about where you live isn't just a physical location. My son grew up in Brooklyn, but where he lives is the New York City subway system. He was a transit obsessive from a young age, now works, in fact, as a consultant. Compendious knowledge of the New York City subway system. And for many of you, where you live isn't just I'm on this block or I'm in this neighborhood. It's I know something about some diaspora, some service, some function, some idea in New York. And documenting those things, as well as just it would be good to get more documentation about Brooklyn's Chinatowns, is, I think, a big part of understanding what Wikipedia can do. You can take relatively abstract concepts, and as long as people can agree on them, you can make an article that you can then show to people and they will understand something about this city. I'm hoping that that list is not just a list of proper nouns, not just a list of places and people, but has some systems and some ideas that make New York, for many of us where we live, includes that possibility of expanding out from just a sort of geographic membership.
Yeah, just with your son, I think we've got some people here with a compendious knowledge of the New York City transit system. Yeah, well, just one thought that came to mind is this idea of improving articles for New York. And there's always a discussion about how the different affiliate groups should share information. But I'm just hopeful that this can be an example to other affiliate groups and to other cities, because that way it's a little less insular. I know that's obviously the focus, but then we can get kind of the benefits throughout.
Actually, that sort of leads into my next question for you, which is you've reported on Wikipedia and you've written a novel that is based on Wikipedia and the doings of Wikipedians. Perspective of that knowledge, what's something you think the Wikipedia community could be doing better to help continue to keep this movement going and growing? And what's something that you think it's doing really well?
Well, that's a good question. Well, first of all, I think there's sometimes a risk as a journalist to just do the scandalous click thing. And I've been trying to avoid that. But if a prominent figure's Wikipedia page is vandalized for 2 seconds, is that really worth, right before it gets locked, is that really worth an article? And so I think hopefully Wikipedia reporting generally has gotten a little bit better since then. I think the thing that's a little less understood among non-Wikipedians, non-Wikimedians is that it's not so much just like editing the text. It's really these debates and the discourse behind the scenes, the very exhaustive conversations. I guess what Wikimedians can be doing better. It's hard because it's faceless. Sometimes when usually someone who's very new to Wikipedia isn't getting the edit or the change that they want, they just like, oh, these jerks on Wikipedia. They just kind of assume the worst. And I just think there's sort of a constant need for Wikimedians to explain and re-explain. This is really steeped in policy. These are arguments. And we were talking about getting tired. I think one thing that I'm just getting tired in light of the political environment and stuff like that. But I think one issue, I think, for Wikimedians is it can get really exhausting to have to just explain over and over neutral point of view and verifiability, all the different policies. And so maybe if they can find new and creative ways to bring new people in. The project's always needing fresh blood. I don't think it should be taken as a given that it's always going to have a steady number of contributors. And if people need to take a wiki break for a while, just because it gets really overwhelming, I think that's fine. And a lot of times they get back into it. But and I've written this a lot, but I really admire the people who have stayed with the project and have been volunteering for a long time.
I'll just say that I think it does best is it's an encyclopedia anyone can edit. The fact that it's true, which we all take for granted, is completely extraordinary. Like it is a new form of arguing. It is up there, in my view, with peer review, Robert's Rules of Order, Socratic dialogue. Like when people get a new structure for hashing things out as a group, it can be transformative. What I think we do badly is a lot of what you're saying about rules. The modal number of edits for editors is 1, which means if you have made 2 edits, you are in the top half of all Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Right? So I think a thing we can do better is to say you do not have to obsessively sit on a page or smoke jump into the places where semi-locked articles are having an edit war. If you make a couple of edits a year, you are part of the core that makes this work. And I think we concentrate so much on the really incredible, like, this person does it all the time, or this person is absolutely essential to this group of pages. Those people obviously are great, but also they don't need any extra encouragement from us. What I think can be useful is to say 1 edit is great, 2 edits is great, 5 edits is great. Like, give people a sense that even at the sort of modest contribution level, the it makes such a difference to have the diversity of eyes on these things, and that you don't have to think, oh my gosh, how am I going to find a couple of hours a week to do this? But instead to say, I'd like to do a little more of this, and that actually puts me in the top half of this distribution and is really the sort of the, I guess I'd call it the seed corn contributions that makes the integration of the whole project.
Well, I actually want to add my own answer to that on top of these great answers, which is that I think that this capacity of Wikipedia to come together in real life is really special. I mean, I can't think of too many other online projects or even entities that are able to just like get people into a room about something they are really interested in, really like, or really love. I mean, as a journalist, I work with people now every day who I have never met face to face in like breathing the same air. For years, I've worked with these people. And by contrast, starting to come to the Wiki NYC meetings really does help me feel like I'm part of something that is both bigger than myself and that welcomes my membership. And it's also just like a really great way to break the isolation. So I'm kind of selling coming to Wiki NYC events and meetings. We started with the dire and have moved into the positive towards the end here. So I think we're probably about ready to wrap it up. Any parting words that we haven't yet discussed?
Yeah, well, just a quick anecdote. I was having drinks with a friend back in Texas the other night, and it's a person who I just have pretty different beliefs than. But at one point, I was pulling up something, showing it on Wikipedia, and he's like, oh, you can't trust Wikipedia. It reflects what's in reliable, mainstream, legacy media sources. But then just later in the conversation, literally the same conversation, he pulled up something about tariffs on Wikipedia and was trying to make an argument to me. I was like, did you forget this? So I think it was such cognitive dissonance, but it's as Wikipedia has a real brand. And I think to the extent we can protect it and also just remember that we have that brand, it's important.
The only thing I'll add is there's something you know that Wikipedia needs, and you could fix that this afternoon. It's really incredible to be able to see a problem and then solve it yourself in a short loop without needing permission or help. And I think that that's been a great thing for the length of Wikipedia's existence. But right now, especially, I think that feels like a blessing.
Thank you both very much. It's been my privilege to talk with you.
Right.